What is Putin doing? I don't know everything, and there are some things that can't be known because nothing, it seems, is neutral and everything is complicated in war, but I do know this much. I know that what Vladimir Putin is doing is, first of all, bad. It's a bad thing. Second of all, it's mad, it's crazy. Let me deal with each of those in turn. And let me do so with an illustration on the point about this being bad. I will never do this, but just imagine for a moment. If I were to brutally beat and seriously injure a woman, you would be shocked and horrified that I would do that, and she'd be suffering. If I said to you, but she provoked me, you wouldn't excuse me, and neither should you. If I said, but I warned her for years and that she needed to stop provoking me, you still wouldn't excuse me, and neither should you. If I said, oh no, but you don't understand, she's a bad egg, it's a complicated situation, she controlled, she manipulated, she domineered, it went on for ages, well fine. She might have done some wrong things, but you would not excuse me, and neither should you. Why? Because some acts are wrong. They can't be justified and excused. Context doesn't make them right. So let me be clear, this is a very different set of circumstances, but that principle applies. Invading another country against its will and the will of its people, and killing, maiming, and displacing for the sake of power and territory is wrong. What Putin is doing is wrong, it cannot be justified, and I've been a bit saddened in some quarters by the lack of moral outrage over this, even amongst some conservatives, as if it's all just the complexities of world affairs and everyone's as bad as each other and we can't really have a clear view on the rights and wrongs of the situation. Again, forget the complexities for a second, which I'll get to. This much is wrong. Death and bloodshed, displacement and misery, invasion. Can we not condemn that much? Lament that much? Be clear about that much? I think we must. But what would make Putin do such a thing? This is another question. It doesn't excuse it, but it gives us some insights into the why. And this is where I come to the second point. I said that he was mad. He did something that seems quite crazy. Even people who are empathetic to Russia were saying right up until the last minute that he would never invade Ukraine because it would be such an insane thing to do. And of course he did that insane thing and he surprised everybody. Why? Well, he told the world why. He did a 1-hour speech as the invasion was about to launch, and it's out there if you can go and find it and you can watch it for yourself. And I'm going to show you from that speech what his reasons are and what's making this man tick. He's pretty clear. The speech covers 4 major themes. First of all, that Ukraine is truly a part of Russia and ought to be Russian. That's really what he's saying. Secondly, that the Ukrainian government is corrupt, they collude with Western powers, and it's bad for the people. Third, that NATO needs to back off and Ukraine needs to stay out of NATO. Fourth, he is liberating the people of Donbass in eastern Ukraine from mortal danger. Now, I'm arguing that only one of those 4 things really explains, really justifies a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the taking of Kiev. Something as crazy as that. Something as big as that. It only matches, it's a conclusion that only matches one of those justifications. The others play a role, but they're not big enough. There's only one. It's not the conflict in Donbass. It's not Eastern European bloc countries joining NATO. It's not internal corruption in Ukraine. It's not the economic problems of Ukraine. It is rather the first one. It is the belief that Ukraine should never have left the motherland, the belief that Ukraine should not exist as a nation state, the belief that Ukraine should belong to Russia. That's the real reason. That's the only reason that connects properly and fully with the actions that we're seeing and explains them. But I'll come back to that. Let me deal with the other 3 first and just show you what he means by these for context. Firstly, Donbass. This is a region in far eastern Ukraine. It's on the Russian border. It's got about 4 million people in it. And 8 years ago, following the conflict in Crimea, a war broke out in Donbass. It was fueled by separatists who, in other words, are pro-Russia. They want to separate from Ukraine. The long story short is this. It's a real pig's breakfast, has been for a long time. People have died, the region is in a mess, sporadic war and conflict continues, the blame game is never ending. There's been EU efforts to broker peace with the various parties through the Minsk agreements. They've ultimately come to nothing. The 2 separatist groups themselves actually have played a key role in undermining those peace agreements. Now, Putin says in his speech that Ukraine and the West are organising, get this, organising and funding an underground terrorist movement in the region. He says that there is genocide occurring, neo-Nazis, terrorists and extreme nationalists are oppressing the separatists and the people of the region. The The Western view of the situation, however, is quite different. And indeed, those I've spoken to about this, and the consensus seems to be that actually the trouble was probably started by Russia inciting these separatists in these Russian majority areas and agitating and giving them support and all the rest of it. And it would make sense in terms of timing, because it was immediately on the back of the Crimea move, and the Crimea move is connected even in the way Putin talks with this move. And also by doing that, by getting in there to create trouble and then, an opportunity to solve the problem, there's a permission structure for Russia to intervene. Now, of course, you say, well, if it was on the back of Crimea, why didn't Putin move then? Well, Trump was president, and that really is the reason. But here's the thing. Donbass is home to two self-declared separatist states, Luhansk and Donetsk. If the liberation of these two separatist states were truly, really Putin's confined, specific goal, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the taking of Kiev is total overkill. The localized issues in Donbass do not fully, properly explain this, though Putin relies on it and though his delegates rely on it when they speak at the UN, if you've seen any of those speeches. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing he raises is NATO. And there is something in this. When the USSR was disbanded, Russia was promised that NATO would not move, and I quote, 1 inch east. That's a quote, 1 inch east from Germany. America and the NATO allies have comprehensively broken that promise. It was made a long time ago, I know, but they have broken it. It was probably a key promise that enabled the fairly easy disbanding of the USSR, all things considered at the time. It has become a lie. In 1999, NATO added Poland, Czechia and Hungary. In 2004, they added Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovenia and Slovakia. In 2009, they added Albania and Croatia. In 2017, Montenegro, and in 2020, North Macedonia. And Russia is really up in arms about this because they see NATO as essentially an anti-Russia alliance. Putin says he asked Bill Clinton whether they would ever consider Russia joining, and said that obviously it's out of the question. In his speech, Putin calls this NATO expansion, he calls it, quote, a knife to the throat. He says the promise that was made then should have created, quote, a belt of states friendly to Russia. He says that if Ukraine joins NATO, Russia is at risk, observing that US weapons launched from Ukraine could strike east of the Ural Mountains and reach Moscow in minutes. He says Ukraine would be, quote, a forward springboard for such a strike. Commenting on this NATO expansion, Putin says, quote, the authorities of some Eastern European countries trading in Russophobia brought their complexes and stereotypes about the Russian threat to the NATO alliance and insisted on building up collective defense networks which should be deployed primarily against Russia. In other words, he's saying, look, this NATO expansion is a threat to me. They don't like me. They're saying that they need protection against Russia. 2 points just to note. First, to become a NATO member, the country has to accept the invite. No one's coerced into it. Obviously, it's beneficial because of the military stuff and all the rest of it, but the fact is that each of these Eastern Bloc countries that has joined has done so to be under the wing of the West, not under the wing of Russia. Putin calls this Russophobia and says it's because of programs to indoctrinate people against Russia in these countries, including things like the teaching of the English language in schools instead of the Russian language. The truth is, these countries don't want Russian protection. They want America. They want Western alignment, not Russian alignment. And as we shall see, that is very, very deeply upsetting, almost wounding to Putin because of the way he views the region as essentially Russia, or at least Russia's rightful sphere of influence. Second, is America really going to launch nuclear weapons or even lesser attacks against Russia from Ukraine? Is that really on America's agenda? Are they going to bomb Russia, nuke Russia? Well, no, they're not, but they are containing Russia. And when a dog is backed into a corner, it lashes out and it bites. I'm not calling Putin or Russia a dog, but I'm making the point about getting nervous and lashing out. And I do understand that point. I don't agree, but I understand the depth of feeling here. And I do agree with this. The West has broken its promise to Russia, and it shouldn't have if that promise was there. The West doesn't quite have clean hands in this matter. But does it justify a full-scale invasion? No. It may be frustrating. It may demonstrate loss of power in the region. It may demonstrate containment by a greater power than yourself. It's not justification, though. It doesn't connect quite with what Putin is doing. Thirdly, he argues in that speech extensively that the Ukrainian government is corrupt, and man, he sticks the boot into them over this. He calls that corruption, unemployment, loss of manufacturing, the closure of businesses, all sorts of stuff. He says it's because they're aligning with their, quote, Western masters and ignoring the needs of the people. And there has been some Western political interference in Ukraine. It's all very complicated. I won't go into it, and probably stupid and unnecessary. But Putin says that he says that Ukraine uses the threat of closer ties to Russia as blackmail against the West to get things out of them, and he implies that they do the same in reverse to blackmail Russia. And he says, look, we've given Ukraine aid, we've traded with them, and we've forgiven their debts, and yet Ukraine aligns with the West anyway. This is obviously a real, problem for him. He says, quote, the officials in Kiev replaced partnership with a parasitic attitude, acting at times in an extremely brash manner. But you see again what's really behind this. It's Russia's loss of influence over Ukraine. Ukraine's steadily increasing alignment with the West. But see, Ukraine's its own nation. It's really Ukraine's business more than it is Russia's. Does it justify an invasion? Even if you're concerned about the way it's going, even if you're concerned about the way it's relating to the West or what the West is doing politically, does it justify an invasion? It's not the rational consequence of this concern. But the whole question of influence gets a lot closer to explaining things, which brings me to the final point that Putin actually makes in his speech, and the most extensive point he makes in his speech. And he says, he opens it with this actually, he spends a lot of time on it. I think it gives away his truest motives. Not his only motives, there's other things feeding this, but the ones that lurk the deepest and the ones that have been enduring the longest, and the ones that match the madness of what he's actually doing. I'm going to give some quotes to you that go to this issue. He says this, quote, Ukraine is not just a neighbouring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our culture, our history and spiritual space. He calls Ukraine, quote, what has historically been Russian land. He goes on, quote, I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia. And Lenin and his associates did it in a way that was extremely harsh on Russia by severing what was historically Russian land. Nobody asked the millions of people living there what they thought. By the way, everything I'm reading, I wouldn't take it as a history lesson per se. This is Putin's take on it. So that's not what I'm doing, but I'm explaining what he's saying. He adds a note as well, by the way, that Crimea, not just Ukraine, but Crimea also belonged to Russia in the past. And of course, he has to say that to justify what he did there in 2014. And then he goes on, quote, why was it necessary, he says, to appease the nationalists to satisfy the growing nationalist ambitions on the outskirts of the former empire? So he says there's these nationalists that wanted these separate territories. Why do we have to appease them, he says? What was the point of transferring to the newly, often arbitrarily formed administrative units, the Union Republics, vast territories that had nothing to do with them? Let me repeat that these territories were transferred along with the population of what was historically Russia. Note, he's concerned about land, he's concerned about population. Why? Well, because population is power. I think China, he might as well have added resources since Ukraine is the most resource-rich country in Europe. He goes on. The disintegration of our united country was brought about by he's talking about the USSR, was brought about by the historic strategic mistakes on the part of the Bolshevik and the CPSU leadership. Mistakes committed at the different times in state building and in economic and ethnic policies. The collapse of the historical Russia, known as the USSR, is on their conscience, he says. So he laments that. He calls the loss of Ukraine and the other former Soviet states, quote, outright pillage of Russia. He now says that there's a program of Russophobia in Ukraine, quote, trying to distort the mentality and historical memory of millions of people of entire generations living in Ukraine. Another quote, he says to them rhetorically, are you renouncing your own past from the so-called colonial heritage of the Russian Empire? There it is. Now we're getting closer to, if I could say, the madness. I'm not actually saying that Putin is mad. I don't think a lot of these guys are. But it reveals his thinking. It reveals what goes into it. He's never gotten over the disintegration of the USSR. He laments the tactics of Western powers to cozy up to former Soviet states, thus accelerating what's no doubt happening anyway, which is their westernization. He sees their participation in NATO as the ultimate betrayal, both from NATO itself and from them. And as I said, well, I can sort of appreciate some of his thoughts there. But he is backed into a corner and he's contained from a geopolitical power perspective. And from his viewpoint, with his historical memory, with his desires and hopes and dreams, well, I see it. I get it. It's wrong. And this whole idea, well, it's starting to drive a form of madness, as I said. That's the concern. It's really, how far is he willing to take this? What really is in his ambitions? How much of an expansionist is he really going to be? There was Georgia, there was Crimea, now there's Ukraine. Not just Donbass, but the whole lot. He's acting like a man who is running out of time to bring the band back together, to bring back some of those former Soviet states into the family, Russia's true sphere of influence. He clearly laments it and sees Russia as disempowered in the modern world. And of course, that's his frustration. Loss of power and containment by greater powers. It's true, you think about it, you say, well, what will be the next superpower after America? And if someone says Russia, you just go, well, that's not possible. Not enough people, not a strong enough economy. They just don't have enough in their quarter. It's got to be China because they've got so much more. Population being, key, but also the economic progress and all the rest of it. Russia's only hope, or Putin's only hope, I should say, I don't want to throw in the Russian people with this, but Putin's only hope of real global superpower status, it lies in the land, the population, and the economies of the former Soviet countries. He can never be a China. He can never stand up to America any other way. That's his real predicament. And the weight of perceived historical injustices only adds to the frustration. Now, in that is a cocktail of things that explains a certain kind of madness that would see him actually fully invade Ukraine. Does it make him right? It certainly doesn't. I said that, it's bad. It's real bad. It does explain what he's doing. But here's the other point. If we see his motives as he has explained them, clearly in his speech, and you can watch it for yourself, and if we see the badness of the act of invasion, then there's a moral principled point to be made that the invasion of Ukraine needs to be opposed absolutely.